My name is Juliana Nicolasian with the Oklahoma State University Library. Today is Thursday, March 26, 2009, and I'm in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, interviewing Betty Price. This interview is being conducted as part of the inductees of the Oklahoma Women's Hall of Fame Oral History Project. Betty Price was inducted into the Oklahoma Women's Hall of Fame in 1985. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's begin by learning a little more about you. Could you start with where you grew up and give us a little background into your early life?
I was born in Boonville, Arkansas, and lived with my family in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and El Paso. And then we moved to Muskogee, and therefore I was ready for first grade, and so I started school in Muskogee, and that's where our home was after that.
So, tell me a little bit about the schools you attended growing up as a young girl in Muskogee.
Well, I attended Longfellow, what we call grade school in those days, and West Junior High School and Central High School in Muskogee. I loved school, and of course, we thought Longfellow was the best of all schools, and formed lasting friendships there.
Now, was Longfellow quite large or very small?
It was a large school, and at that time we didn't have kindergarten, so we started first grade, and that's where we made a lot of our lifetime friendships.
So, what were some of your favorite subjects growing up?
Well, I loved art and music, and I liked spelling. And in high school, I liked Spanish. Thought that was a lot of fun. I also was involved in journalism. I have a story about this. My father had so wanted me to be a teacher that when I decided I was going to take typing in high school, he tried to stand in the way of that because he didn't want me to become a secretary. As things happened in my life, it was the ability to be the co-editor of the high school newspaper in Muskogee, and then going to Northeastern State University. I received a scholarship the second year to be the editor of the college newspaper. And even though I was a music major, it just worked out great.
Wow, did you think you had a career in journalism budding or?
Well, I didn't think so because my father wanted me to be a teacher, as I said, and he and mother both had convinced me that I should be a music teacher, and so that's what I plan to do for my career.
So, growing up, did you play instruments, music classes?
We had a rule in our house that we couldn't touch the piano until we were in the second grade. And mother would play for us, but we didn't get to touch the piano. Then in second grade, we could take piano lessons. And so I had a tyrant for a teacher, Miss Mary DeGraffenreid, and she taught violin and piano. And she was a very tough teacher. I used to play, I remember just thinking, I'm doing this so well. I wish Mr. Graffenreid would come up on the porch and hear me playing. She always made me a little nervous, I think. But we had recitals, and there was a lot of fun there. But I had fun doing a lot of different things in the pep squad, and being the co-editor of the newspaper for our high school in Muskogee really took me away from my music somewhat. We had chorus as well, and so I was always participating in that. But it was fun to be involved with the school newspaper, and then fun again to be involved with it at college, although it was hard work.
You mentioned your parents did not want you to become a secretary, they wanted you to become a teacher. Growing up back then, what were career options for women outside of teaching?
Career options were being a nurse, a secretary, or a teacher. That was basically what you could choose from. And with all of my emphasis on music, it just seemed like a good idea that I do that. But let me tell you what happened. In taking typing and journalism classes, it enabled me later when I was, I had taught 2 years of school. I taught my first year at Norman, and I was a music teacher for 2 schools every day. So I had all of the students in those 2 schools every day. But it was a great time at OU, and I enjoyed that. And Norris finished his degree there. The second year, I taught 2nd grade, and that was in Oklahoma City. And we settled in, and Norris went into real estate at that time. But this business of typing, I got my scholarship with my ability to be the editor of the newspaper. And that way I stayed in school and got my music degree. And I was the outstanding senior woman, which my parents were very proud of.
Well, that's great you had that that funding to go to school, because I'm sure, at that time it was hard in Oklahoma.
It was. It really was. And I had a brother and a sister, and we all had to be educated. My father worked for the post office, and that was why we had moved to Shawnee, El Paso, and then Muskogee. And so my brother became a doctor, and my sister lives here in Oklahoma City and is my dearest friend.
And are you the oldest, middle, youngest?
I'm the oldest.
All right. So as you're growing up, and your parents are teacher, they want you to become a teacher, did you envision yourself becoming anything else, or was it set?
No, I didn't envision myself being anything else other than a teacher. After I taught the two years, I became pregnant with our first child, Lisa. And so I started teaching piano lessons while we had 3 children. And our family was always interested in politics, and the dinner conversation would usually be political at my house. And I loved this, and I loved to be involved in elections and class officers and that sort of thing. But one of the things that I think evolved was that we lived in a neighborhood where a friend of ours decided to run for the state senate. His name was John Garrett. And so we had all of the family out working hard to get him elected. When he was elected to the state senate, he needed a secretary. And guess what? I was the only one in the neighborhood who could type. And so I went to work for him. And that changed the career, that changed the whole career path because I came to the state capitol. I loved the building. I started bringing art into our office, and pretty soon other senators were asking for art for their offices. That led to a friendship with George Nye, who was lieutenant governor at that time, and I started working part-time for George Nye as well. And so music teacher no longer, and never to be again, but the most exciting change in my life happened.
Boy, what a difference going from teaching kids to the state capitol.
Yes. And I loved working with legislators. Now, that's not always easy And as I got into my work with the Arts Council, one of the things that helped, I think, was that I had become acquainted with a lot of the legislators, both senators and House members, and the governors. In my career, I have worked for 8 different governors, and some of those were 2-term governors too. So it was something that started because of a political campaign and changed the whole career path.
Thanks to typing.
Thanks to typing.
So with then Lieutenant Governor Nye and then Governor Nye, what work did you do for him?
Well, I worked as a secretary for him, but also I am an artist. And as an artist, he decided that he would like me to paint all of the state emblems. And so I researched the state emblems, and I did a large plaque that had all of these state emblems on it. And when the tour guides would start on the first floor of the Capitol, they eventually would come up to the 5th floor, which is where the Lieutenant Governor's office was at that time. And they would use that then to inform their students or the people who were visiting about our state. And it was a lot of fun. I found out that the state colors were green and white, and nobody knew what the state colors were, and used various things. There have been a lot that have been added to the state emblems since then, but this gave us a chance to visit with the young people who came there. And then I painted a painting of the Capitol and an oil derrick for George Nye's office, and he still has that painting.
Now, back then, was there a lot of art in the Capitol?
No. When we were in high school, I came to the Capitol with the student council, and we had a day at the Capitol, and that was the biggest building I'd ever been in, and I loved it. The only thing was there was very little art in the building. There was the World War I memorial that had been there since 1928 on the south side of the Capitol. And then after I started working in the legislature, there were 4 portraits that were in the 4th floor, and those were done by Charles Banks Wilson of Oklahoma's famous, the Senator Kerr and Jim Thorpe and Sequoia and Will Rogers. But other than that, there were just bare walls every place else.
So after you worked for Governor Nye, what did you go on to do?
Well, I was approached one day at the Festival of the Arts downtown. I would take a week off during the legislative session and go participate in the festival. And I met the director of the Oklahoma Arts and Humanities Council, which was what it was called at that time. And he asked me to go to work for the Arts Council. And I didn't think I wanted to work full time. My husband thought it was a good idea because I had been on committees. I helped establish a mental health clinic and had some other things I was doing. And he decided that our children were growing up and they were going to need to go to college and that I should take this full-time job. Little did he know, nor did I know, that that would be full-time plus because of all of the activities across the state in the arts.
Wonderful. So you joined the Arts Council, the Oklahoma Arts Council, starting back in 1974.
That's right.
And what was one of your first jobs with them?
Well, the reason that they wanted me to go to work for them was because they knew that I had been advocating across the street at the Capitol for arts funding. And I didn't hesitate to talk to these senators and House members about funding. So their idea was that I would do work with people in the Capitol and then be the public information director, which again, typing made possible, for the Arts Council. And so it opened a whole new world to me. And I loved the building, but I kept thinking about art for the building. I was asked to be the co-chair of a ceremony to dedicate the 4 historic murals by Charles Banks Wilson. And that was about 1975, I think. And this gave me a new relationship with the governor's office. Of course, George Nye was not governor yet. He had been lieutenant governor. And it was almost like I was the art person in that building. And painters would ask me to help them decide what color to paint a wall in the building. And now we have the Capitol Preservation Commission, and everything's set up where you don't have random questions like that. But I started spending part of my time at the Capitol visiting with legislators, and it occurred to me one day that it might be nice if we had art available to put in legislative offices. And so we contacted artists and had them bring their paintings to the Capitol. And we had this one day when they would come from all over the state and put paintings out in the rotunda on the 4th floor. And then legislators would come out and choose a work of art for their office. Well, it was wonderful. It gave us access to every office because they all wanted a piece of art, and then you'd have to come in and check on it and visit about it. And so it gave me a chance to really get to know legislators. And then, of course, we were trying to get funding for the Arts Council, and I worked hard on that for many years.
What a great advocacy piece, having that beautiful piece of art in their office, and then, you have to stop by and check on it, and oh, by the way. Now, you became the executive director in 1983. How did this come about?
Well, it came about because the director was leaving, and there were 5 men who had been directors of the Arts Council before I became the director. The National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities were created in 1965. And Henry Bellman was governor, and you had to have state legislation to get the funding from the National Endowment. And so this was when the Oklahoma Arts and Humanities Council was created. And of course, it's now the Oklahoma Arts Council, but that was the name of it at the time. And so it was created to enrich the lives of Oklahomans with the arts. And I worked to help get that funding matching the federal funding in order to make it possible for us to deal with nonprofit organizations in the state that were doing arts projects.
So as executive director, What were, outside of the funding, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I didn't follow through. I didn't follow through. The the 5 men that were directors before me were gone, and I was acting director. And there were some legislators who decided I should be the director. And so they went to the governor and asked him to make me the director of the Arts Council. The council is a 15-member board, and it's their job to do that. But we got the legislature involved. I didn't think I wanted to do this job, but as it turned out, I'm glad I did.
And who was the sitting governor at that time?
At that time, George Nye was governor then, but I befriended all the governors. I liked working in politics and in government, and I liked all of these governors. And there was something about the governor's mansion, for example. If they needed art in the governor's mansion, they would call me. When David Boren came in as governor, I was in the Arts Council at that time, and David had been a House member, and my senator was the mental health chair. And David Boren would come over and sit in the office, and we would visit while he was waiting for Senator Garrett. Well, we just talked about the arts because David loved the arts so much. So when he was elected governor, I was invited to be on his inaugural committee. And I was on that committee because he wanted an inauguration that was absolutely about the arts. And so we had a wonderful, wonderful time. And David Boren has continued to be a very close friend, and I am on the board of visitors for the Weizenhofer College of Fine Arts at OU now.
What were some of the things that were included in his inauguration?
Well, we had a stage center downtown. We had organizations from all over the state come in, trios, dance companies, orchestras, and we had a marvelous, marvelous event where you go from one room to another in order to hear different or see a different performance. And he had a cousin named Hoyt Axton, and Hoyt Axton and Arlo Guthrie came and performed at his inaugural ball. That was a lot of fun.
Oh, I bet. My goodness. So as executive director of the Arts Council, you continuously try to work for increasing awareness and funding. What were some of the other key roles that you were involved with?
Well, we were involved with the nonprofit organizations across the state, and I like to be out with the people who are having performances and meeting the people in these towns. Another thing about working with legislature, you need to know some people in their towns. Their arts people need to get acquainted with their legislator, and a lot of times they weren't. And so it was part of what I saw my job as being was to be aware of what was happening in towns all over the state, and wonderful things were happening. And I feel that the arts enrich a community more than anything else. And so it was fun to go out and get acquainted with people across the state and maybe visit with their legislators while I was in that town. The Arts Council does so much, and I probably expanded the position, by being so interested in the visual arts and in the Capitol, and getting the legislation written to establish a Capitol Preservation Commission. And that then was a way that the Capitol had an overseer, we should say, with the Preservation Commission being responsible for the building and the grounds around the Capitol. And I would be asked to do the commissioning on works of art as we started looking at those bare spaces on the walls. And then some wonderful things happened as a result of that. For example, when we had a state senator who would march me out to the center of the rotunda and show me that space where the Indian ballerina mural is now. And he would march me out there and say, that needs to be a mural of the Indian ballerinas. Then he would go back in and vote against the arts appropriation. This was kind of hard for me to understand, but it started a whole new way of working with the public art in the Capitol. And we commissioned Mike Larson to do the mural. And one of the most wonderful moments of my life is when we had a Sunday opening for the new mural, and the rotunda, there were probably 1,000 people in there. It was just jammed with people. And we had an orchestra, and we had all 5 of the Indian ballerinas together. Mm. And it was the first time they've all been in each other's presence. People thought they danced together all over the world, but they didn't. And so we had the Maria and Marjorie Tallchief, Yvonne Choteau, Rosella Hightower, and Moslyn Larkin. And each one of these women was brought up separately on stage, and we had little ballerinas with a bouquet of roses for each one of them. And then they received a medallion, and David Walters was governor at that time. And he presided with great joy. It was so wonderful to have these women there. Then 5 years later, we brought them back and made them cultural treasures. And cultural treasures is something that we developed during my time as the director of the Arts Council. And these are people like John Hope Franklin, who unfortunately died yesterday, a very, very wonderful historian and friend. And we have others like Scott Momaday and Charles Banks Wilson and the ballerinas, all of the ballerinas. And the first one was Tayada, the Indian storyteller. And we celebrated Tayada, and she was still living at the time. So we had her as our first cultural treasure.
Well, now that we're talking about the Capitol, can you take me through some of the work that was commissioned in the building?
Yes, we had the Oklahoma Black Gold was another one of the Lunette murals, and it was done by an artist named Jeff Dodd. And Jeff is a fabulous artist, but just to kind of clarify something about getting these murals up into those spaces, we had engineers that helped us with that, but I had to get the molding. You needed to examine the molding before the mural went up, and Jeff had a fear of heights. And so I was the one on the cherry picker that went up and examined the moldings, and I loved it. I didn't mind those heights at all. In fact, when the dome was put on the Capitol, that was when I went up on the scaffolding to inspect the murals that were being I'm messing up right
Oh, you're fine.
I enjoyed going to these heights to inspect the Capitol art.
Well, it's good you weren't afraid of heights.
Right. My husband doesn't like them very well, but I wasn't afraid of them at all. We have Wilson Hurley murals on the second floor, and those are mural-sized paintings, actually, that Wilson finally agreed to do. Wilson Hurley was born in Tulsa, but he ended up living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we became good friends. And I tried to persuade him to paint these paintings, and he, at one point, said that artist that did the ballerina murals, he meant for his to be the most important work of art in the Capitol. And so he finally was persuaded, with the help of one of my council members, Anna Allspaw. He was persuaded to do those 4 paintings, and that was good. We created galleries in the Capitol too. There is a gallery on the first floor for changing exhibits. There's a gallery for photography. And then we have our state art collection gallery. And the legislature named that gallery for me, and that's been so exciting. And because I know it's going to be there for a long time. And so the Betty Price Gallery is where the state art collection rests at this point. We also have a gallery next to the Blue Room. George Nye called me one day after he had gone in as governor, and he said, "Come over here, I want to ask you about something." And he had this space that was between the governor's office and the Blue Room. And the Blue Room, of course, is the ceremonial room that the governors use frequently. And so I asked him what he was planning, and he said, "I think this should be an art gallery." And so I got busy and visited some museums and found out how you do that. And so we have the Governor's Gallery, and the Arts Council keeps all of these exhibits, these changing exhibits, going, and it's quite a job. It truly is, but people love it, and I love to see a legislator or someone that maybe a maintenance person in the building looking at the new exhibits. They seem to really like it. I think 2 major works of art that are important to our building are the 2 sculptures outside. And I was on the Centennial Commission, and the Guardian by Senator Kelly Haney is atop the building, and it was my job to, number one, decide what this was going to be, who was it going to be, and then who the artist was going to be. And so I had a wonderful committee, and we determined that there should be an Indian on top of the building. And then we ran a competition for the artist, and Senator Haney got the competition, won the competition. It was really great. the sculpture in front of the Capitol is by Alan Hauser, and I became acquainted with Alan Hauser shortly after I had started, while I was working as the interim director for the Arts Council, and got acquainted with him and started working with him. His studio in Santa Fe was fascinating, and I loved to get out there when it was the right timing. And this was a sculpture that he and David Boren talked about. David liked Alan's work as well, and he called me one night from Alan's studio, and he said, I have just seen this wonderful figure that Alan wants to do. And I said, well, what about the one he and I were talking about? No, this is a different one. So I got outvoted, and I'm really glad I did. This is a wonderful sculpture, and we're so proud of it. And at the time, Henry Bellman was governor, and we needed $150,000 to pay for that sculpture. As it turned out, Henry Bellman vetoed some of his own legislation, but he left the money in for the sculpture. He had David Boren on the phone and Senator Penny Williams, and they persuaded him that he should leave the funding in there. That sculpture is way over $1 million now if you were to purchase it. So it was a great time for us.
Mm.
We had a ceremony inside the building for the sculpture, and then came outside, and we had this gigantic red parachute that covered the sculpture, and it started raining a little bit. And so the parachute got pulled off of the sculpture before we were quite ready. It quit raining, and they had an Indian dance on the plaza. So that was one of our events that was so memorable.
Well, I was telling you before we started today, I've been to several state capitals, and Oklahoma's is by far, it just blows you away when you walk in. Just the art everywhere is just amazing.
Senator Charles Ford has headed up some commissions of art in the Senate, and there is a lot more art now as a result of his efforts.
Now, you of course have been in the Capitol pre and post dome.
Mm-hmm.
You are a domer.
That's right. And I was able to climb up to the heights when the dome was being constructed with a hard hat, and went up, and it's pretty exciting when you're involved somewhat in the process. And the dome had been a wish of some people that I was associated with for a long time, and it was just nice to see that finally happen. I was asked to be on the Centennial Commission, and so that opened up a lot of doors for the arts, because how better to celebrate than with the arts. And we're so proud of the towns across this state that had their centennial projects, but the dome was major for us. And I worked with Blake Wade, who was the director of the Centennial Commission, and I think Oklahoma had a great celebration. Absolutely wonderful. I haven't talked very much about the council. I've talked a lot about the Capitol and working with visual arts, which I love to do. But the Arts Council has, as a state agency, has matching funding for nonprofit organizations. And this has to be for art projects. And we have a granting process. Part of our funding comes from the National Endowment for the Arts still, but we were able to get our funding up quite high over what we were getting from the endowment. It's still such a small part of the state budget. 0.1% of the state budget is for the arts, and the arts are so important. You know, one of my passions has been to get art and music teachers back in our schools, elementary schools. My role models were the art teacher and the music teacher, and we started first grade doing art. And my friend Helen Subeb, my closest friend, was an artist too. And as children, we painted together and did all kinds of arts projects and have stayed as friends all our lives, and even met in Taos, New Mexico, and painted together at certain times. But the thing that I feel we must have is the enrichment that the arts give the people across this state. And yes, it's good to have your governors involved and your legislators involved, but there are thousands of people in this state who serve on these nonprofit boards just to make something cultural happen in their towns. You have a wonderful artist in residence program where artists go in and work with children. The things that our organizations do are so well planned and well executed. And as I said, I have tried to be out across the state and working, seeing these events and talking to these teachers and parents and arts advocates about what they are doing for their hometown. We also had a lot of centennial projects that were art related, and so that again was a perfect way to celebrate the centennial.
So much, so much was developed as a result of the centennial. It's amazing. It's astonishing. I still come across books and I'm like, wow, I didn't know they made this book as part of the centennial. I mean, that's really neat.
Yes. A lot of books came as a result of the centennial.
So you've probably been to every county in the state, in Oklahoma?
Mm-hmm. I've been to every county in Oklahoma. And of course, we have to have a nonprofit to come to us for grants. But we have been in we've been in at least 70 counties across the state with some kind of art project. We also had a cultural coalition for about 10 years, and that was working with the Museums Association, the Visual Arts, and other associations to kind of look at the big picture. And we had great Congress on the Arts and Humanities when David Boren was governor, and continued this sort of thing where we're sitting with others who are running statewide organizations. And I think that is more efficient, and also the creativity that you have when you are there with other people who have such a vision for their particular subject, whether it be a museum or a music organization or dance or any of those. Humanities we were also engaged with.
So you're very well connected in the Oklahoma arts community. Who are some of your favorite Oklahoma artists?
Well, I've enjoyed working with Mike Larson. with the Indian ballerina painting, and so I've enjoyed working with him. The relationship with Alan Hauser, who died in 1970, no, I'm sorry, died in 1984. Alan Hauser was nationally and internationally known, and we were very good friends. I would try to be out in New Mexico as frequently as possible, and always would be with Alan at his studio and with his wonderful wife Anne, who is now 96 years old, and she's quite a sprightly little lady. She likes to go to the casinos, and she wins a lot of money. But it just gives me a wonderful friend that I have there, even though Alan is gone. But I traveled to Washington with him when he got the National Medal of Arts. I traveled to New York when a sculpture of his was set at the United Nations. And so it was like, here's a chance for Oklahoma to celebrate Alan Hauser, who was born in Oklahoma, celebrate Alan, and show how much culture we have in our state. Alan's work is on the OU campus now. It's at the tribal headquarters at Apache. And it's kind of interesting. Alan was the first baby born after Geronimo's band was released from Fort Sill. And he was very proud of that. And he worked on getting a letter from an older tribal member to document the fact that he was the first baby born out of captivity. And it just is part of that wonderful mystique that we have with our artists. Other artists that I admire include Charles Banks Wilson. The historical murals are wonderful works of art. And when I was up on the scaffolding examining those, I just appreciated him more than I ever had. We went to the Smithsonian with him when he was going to mount those murals, and the murals were spread out on the floor and glued on to plexiglass forms before they were raised and installed in the building. So Charles Banks Wilson is one of my favorites, and he is 90 years old. I saw him a couple of weeks ago when he was honored at the History Center. Dr. John Hope Franklin just died yesterday, and John Hope was a dear friend and a cultural treasure. And he enjoyed coming back to Oklahoma and was always speaking someplace, and we became fast friends, and it will be a great loss to Oklahoma. We also have an artist, poet named Scott Momaday, and he is a very close and dear friend of mine, and a great artist and writer. And those are some of the artists that I admire.
And you could probably go on forever and ever.
I could.
Because, I mean, Oklahoma we're a young state, but it has such a rich tradition, especially with Native American art, some of the immigrant populations. I mean, it's such a great tradition.
There are some other things that the council does, we have a touring art program where uh, where orchestras and ballet companies and other performing groups can go into the smaller towns, and we pay half of the fee for them to come in to the towns. For example, Guyman will have the Oklahoma City Philharmonic come out, the Oklahoma Symphony Orchestra come out to Guyman for a concert, and that gives that gives the people in that town a chance to have their own event. And so many of them would never be in Oklahoma City and have the opportunity to enjoy and be enriched with symphony music.
And I mean, it's those little things that, help inspire communities, and you never know, you could have a young child there who says, I want to do that, Mom. And
yes, that's why it's so important that children be exposed to the arts early as possible. The enrichment that the arts give children helps them with their other subjects. I taught second grade, as I mentioned, and it didn't occur to me that you wouldn't use the arts to teach your children. And any subject that you can use the arts, art and music. And when we know that there are children who are not getting art and music in their elementary grades, by third grade, their creativity is just pretty much shut down. So it's it's so important to start as babies being exposed to the arts, and then in school to have the teachers. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's something that changes how they feel about themselves. We even have an alternative art program where there are alternative schools where children or teenagers can come into an environment where they might be able to learn to play the guitar or to write or to paint. And it gives them a new self-esteem, and they can become better students as a result of getting engaged and wanting to be there the day they're doing the art. And some of them have gone on to be substantial providers to the communities, and they really were lost, and the arts have enriched them and brought them to success.
Well, one other thing the council is involved with is the Governor's Arts Awards.
That's correct.
Could you tell me a little bit about that, please?
Yes. The director of the Arts Council called me into his office one day while I was public information director, and he said, I have found that another state has a Governor's Arts Award. I want you to find out about it. And so he handed the project to me, and it was very exciting. I contacted that state, which was South Carolina, and found out what they were doing. And then we started this, and this was during David Boren's administration. And this Governor's Arts Awards is a favorite of mine because people nominate from all over the state. And then you have various awards, the Governor's Award, you have an art education award, and community service awards. And so there are many ways that people can be recognized. And we always do that at the state capitol with the governor presiding. And we have people come from all over the state to celebrate these wonderful advocates for the arts. The Governor's Arts Awards is one of the oldest programs in the nation, and probably it's so beautiful in the Capitol building that probably it will always be held there. But it celebrates some artists, not very many. This is more about businessmen and women who have contributed to the arts and helped in, let's say, a ballet company, done substantial support for ballet company. And occasionally we will always have a performance during Governor's Arts Awards, but there are very few artists that are chosen. The Cultural Treasures takes care of some of those, but Governors will take care of a few. In fact, the first Governor's Arts Award we had, Charles Banks Wilson received. But the philanthropists are very important to the arts and the future of the arts. And so we like to thank them with a medallion. I designed this medallion. It's called the Allen Hazard Medallion. And I designed this medallion to not only honor Allen Hazard, but also to be something that was associated with the state capitol and that people would have that memory.
You know, from your early days with the emblem with Governor Nye and designing the medallion, have you designed other pieces that are currently in use?
No, I really haven't.
Okay. Just checking. Just
okay.
checking. Now, you recently retired from the Arts Council. And I know you continue to remain very busy. One of the groups you're involved with is the Red Earth Advisory Board. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Red Earth was an idea that came from Justice Yvonne Cogger. She thought that Oklahoma needed an Indian festival to celebrate all of our wonderful, talented Indian artists. And so a small group came together, and one of the things that I want on my tombstone is Red Earth, because Red Earth is the title that came from me just out of the blue when we were meeting and trying to decide on whether we were going to call this the Indian Exposition of 19 so-and-so, or had real long names, and it just kept beating in my heart that we needed something that was short and to the point. And so Red Earth was selected as the name. We have had great success with Red Earth. The thing that we didn't realize was how spectacular the dancing would be. And we were so anxious to help Indian artists that we didn't realize we were going to be helping Indian dancers too. And it's a great festival. One of the things that Oklahoma needs is to celebrate its Indian population and the artists especially. Indians have the arts as part of their lives. Mm-hmm. They really do. And in many of their ceremonials and tribal affairs.
Now, we learned the background we need for our careers in many different places. Sometimes it's from real world experience, sometimes it's in school. Where have you learned the background you needed for your career?
Well, I think that I had wonderful teachers and teachers who took time with me. That is one thing that happened at Northeastern. The classes were small, and in most cases, and so you had some individual attention from your teachers. The the fact that we were interested in politics at our house and spent time on that uh, gave me an appreciation of government, and I think helped in kind of molding me for what my future would be. The There was a time when I my earned some money, was when I was playing for a church, and I was the church pianist, and I was also in junior high school. So their tiny little bit of money was great for me, and it gave them the chance to have a pianist. And so from the time I was in junior high school, I was working outside of the Baptist church, which is where our family belonged, in Methodist churches. And thoroughly enjoyed doing that, like the choir practice on Wednesday night and then playing for the Sunday services.
And it all comes back around.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Did you face any stumbling blocks or adversity along the way?
Well, I think it's always difficult to get funding for the arts. It's difficult to get funding for anything, but getting funding for the arts is difficult. And I wouldn't call it a stumbling block. It was a challenge to see what we could do to help fund the arts, because the legislature has a mandate that we are to have quality arts experiences for every man, woman, and child in this state. And so as a result, there's a lot of work to be done with not all that much money. But I do think that that having that as a challenge was something that kept me energized.